The earliest surviving descriptions do not begin with ceremony. They begin with broken convoy records, thermal ghosts on Auspex screens, and the after-action testimonies of soldiers who had seen armoured vehicles overturned with a force more commonly associated with siege engines than with living organisms. Across the outer combat zones of Calth, investigators reviewing battlefield pit captures found repeated evidence of a single, heavy Tyranid assault beast operating at the front of major breaches. The footage was inconsistent, often blurred by smoke, dust, and weapons discharge, yet several details appeared again and again. A massive Carnifex strain bioform, unusual resilience under concentrated fire, and damage to the head that should have ended function but did not. Within those fragmented reports, before the stories hardened into legend, the subject was identified by the name Imperial survivors eventually gave it: Old One-Eye. In strict biological terms, Old One-Eye was not a separate Tyranid species, but a singular and infamous example of the Carnifex breed, one of the Hive Mind's most destructive shock organisms. Carnifexes are used as living battering rams in massed assaults, boarding actions, and attacks on fortified lines. They are built for impact, close-quarters violence, and the collapse of resistance through brute force. Old One-Eye emerged from that already fearsome template, but Imperial records consistently describe it as exceptional even by Carnifex standards. It possessed the immense bulk, armoured shell, and close assault power expected of its breed, yet it also displayed regenerative properties and survival patterns that transformed it from a battlefield threat into a subject of continued strategic concern. The best supported point of origin in available lore places Old One-Eye on Calth during the assault of Hive Fleet Behemoth, around 745 of the 41st millennium. This does not mean Calth was the place where the organism was first grown in any human sense of the term. Tyranid organisms are not born into family lines or cultural communities. They are bioengineered manifestations of the Hive Mind, produced for invasion and consumption. In Old One-Eye's case, Calth is simply where the creature first entered Imperial history clearly enough to receive a name, a profile, and a body of recurring reports. From that point onward, every appearance resembling the same scarred Carnifex was interpreted through the memory of Calth. To understand the significance of that emergence, it is necessary to understand the role of the Carnifex within Tyranid warfare. Carnifexes are not subtle organisms. They are deployed where the Hive Mind needs momentum restored, armoured defences smashed, or enemy formations physically broken apart. Their combat logic is brutally direct. They cross fire lanes that would kill lighter bioforms, absorb punishment that would halt lesser organisms, and convert raw mass into tactical collapse. Old One-Eye appears to have been bred or adapted for that same role, but with a degree of persistence that made ordinary kill confirmation unreliable. In practical terms, this meant that units engaging it could not assume that visible catastrophic damage would remain decisive for long. Imperial descriptions from the Calth campaign present a creature of extreme physical intimidation. Old One-Eye is consistently described as a scarred Carnifex, heavily armoured, massive in frame, and equipped with huge crushing claws capable of tearing apart even hardened targets. Its most famous visible injury became the basis of its name. One eye was destroyed by a plasma shot that passed through the socket and into the brain. The injury left a permanent ruin in the skull, and a burn scar that marked the creature thereafter. That permanence matters. Tyranid organisms are often associated with adaptation and recovery, but Old One-Eye's damaged head became both proof that it had once been brought down, and proof that even such a hit had not ended its threat permanently. During Hive Fleet Behemoth's assault on Calth, Old One-Eye was recorded at the spearhead of the attack. Reports describe it swatting aside Leman Russ battle tanks with contemptuous ease, behaviour that helps explain why it lodged so deeply in Imperial memory. Tanks are not symbolic targets in Warhammer 40,000. They are practical anchors of line warfare, mobile strongpoints, and morale assets. For a Tyranid beast to destroy them as though they were obstacles rather than threats immediately altered how survivors framed the engagement. Old One-Eye was not merely another large Xenos organism in a larger swarm. It became, from the first campaign in which it was clearly seen, a localized disaster around which other events were organized. Its first confirmed defeat was achieved only when an unnamed Imperial hero fired a plasma pistol through the creature's eye and into its brain. Even in abbreviated summaries, that detail remains one of the most important pieces of canon attached to Old One-Eye because it establishes the tension that defines the creature's entire legend. It could be stopped. It was not invincible. Yet the injury that should have ended the organism instead became the sign by which it was recognized in later decades. This is where the line between battlefield fact and enduring terror began to form. A wound had been inflicted, a kill had apparently been achieved. But the war with Tyranids does not reward confidence merely because something large has finally fallen down. What followed is central to Old One-Eye's early development as a named subject in Imperial archives. Decades after Hive Fleet Behemoth had been driven from Calth, smugglers discovered the beast body frozen in the ice packs. Believing the corpse valuable enough to claim a bounty, they thawed it. The gamble was fatal. The wounds began healing almost at once, the organism revived, and the smugglers were slaughtered. This episode matters for more than its shock value. It established that Old One-Eye's regenerative capacity was not limited to the heat of active combat. Whether through abnormal mutation, accelerated cell regrowth, or some form of Tyranid biological persistence beyond ordinary assumptions, the creature could remain dormant and then return to function under favourable conditions. Once active again on Calth, Old One-Eye operated outside direct swarm conditions, and this detail reveals something useful about both Tyranid behaviour and the creature's role. Sources note that when isolated from the Hive Mind, a Carnifex reverts toward mindless killing instinct. Yet Old One-Eye still became a focal point for violence on the planet, and lesser Tyranid organisms left behind by the earlier invasion, including termagants and gene stealers, were drawn toward its presence as a dominant organism. This does not mean Old One-Eye possessed personality in a human sense, nor that it commanded through speech or culture. It means that even outside full swarm cohesion, its biological dominance remained strong enough to organize destruction around itself. In that way, its early history already blurred the line between solitary beast and battlefield node. The resulting attacks across Calth were not minor incidents. Land convoys were destroyed, habdomes were smashed, and isolated populations were massacred. These details are important because they show how Old One-Eye's legend expanded from a wartime assault organism into a post-invasion terror phenomenon. In the first phase, it was part of a catastrophic alien offensive. In the second, it became an enduring hazard in the aftermath, a leftover instrument of extermination that kept killing long after the main tendril of the invasion had passed. That endurance is one of the reasons the creature stands out so strongly in Tyranid lore. Many monstrous bioforms are remembered for what they did in battle. Old One-Eye is remembered for continuing to generate battle conditions after the battle was supposed to be over. Its renewed activity eventually drew the attention of Scout Sergeant Telian of the Ultramarines, whose intervention forms the other major early episode in the creature's development as a tracked Imperial threat. Telian located the beast, but found its armoured flanks difficult to penetrate. As his warriors were killed around him, he made an extraordinarily precise shot into the already ruined eye socket. The strike overwhelmed the creature with pain and sent it stumbling into a ravine. A search followed, but no body was recovered. This incident reinforced the same lesson as the earlier plasma hit. Old One-Eye could be brought low by precision and determination, yet final certainty remained elusive. For Imperial forces, that uncertainty was poison. No commander likes a target that might be dead. Fewer still like one that has been probably dead twice. By this stage, the origin story of Old One-Eye had already become inseparable from its recurring reappearances. Reports of similarly scarred Carnifexes emerged across Ultramar and beyond, leading to the enduring rumour that the same beast had been killed more than a dozen times. A careful reading of the sources requires restraint here. The canon strongly supports the rumour itself. It does not prove every later sighting belonged to a single uninterrupted organism. Still, the persistence of the description matters. The damaged eye, the scarred skull, the unusual healing, and the disproportionate carnage created a pattern recognizable enough that Imperial minds kept returning to one conclusion. Whether singular beast, repeated bioform, or some combination of both, Old One Eye had become more than a battlefield contact. It had become a recurring identity. There is also an evolutionary implication in the sources that helps frame Old One Eye's early significance within Tyranid adaptation. Its remarkable healing led to theories that it represented an unstable mutation or a Tyranid experiment in rapid cell regrowth, perhaps even one the Hive Mind had initially abandoned. Later accounts note that with the arrival of Hive Fleet Leviathan, comparable regenerative capability had become close to standard among Carnifexes. That does not reduce Old One Eye's uniqueness. If anything, it sharpens it. Old One Eye appears in the record as one of the earliest and most famous demonstrations of a trait that later became more broadly useful to the Tyranid war effort. In human military terms, it was the terrifying prototype everyone hoped was a one-off, right up until it clearly was not. For the purposes of a lore-accurate opening, the most honest conclusion is this. Old One Eye's origins are not personal but functional. Its early life is not childhood but emergence into record, and its development is measured through repeated survival under conditions that should have erased it from history. It first became known on Calth as a spearhead organism of Hive Fleet behemoth. It was then transformed by damage, by recovery, and by repeated failure of kill confirmation into one of the few Tyranid organisms treated in Imperial memory, almost like an individual adversary. That status was not granted because Tyranids behave like human characters. It was granted because Old One Eye kept doing the one thing bureaucracies and armies hate most. Returning after the paperwork should already have been finished. The physical form of Old One Eye follows the established Carnifex pattern, but every available record emphasizes deviation through damage, endurance, and disproportionate battlefield impact. A standard Carnifex is already among the heaviest frontline bioforms deployed by the Tyranids, built with a low forward-weighted stance, a dense chitinous exoskeleton, and a mass distribution optimized for shock assaults. Old One Eye conforms to this general structure, yet repeated observations describe it as unusually resilient even within that classification. Its body mass is estimated to exceed that of most Carnifex strains encountered during the same campaign periods, with a thicker dorsal carapace and more pronounced plating across the thorax and cranial ridge. This added density did not slow it in any meaningful way. Instead, it reinforced its ability to absorb and continue through sustained fire. The most defining external feature remains the damage to its head. The creature's right eye socket was destroyed by a plasma shot during the early engagements on Calth, with the blast passing through the skull and into the brain. The result was not a clean cavity, but a burned, irregular void surrounded by fused chitin and scar tissue. The surrounding cranial plate shows signs of repeated stress and regrowth, suggesting that the initial trauma was followed by continued structural adaptation, rather than simple healing. The remaining eye retained function, but its positioning and protective ridge appear more developed, possibly compensating for the loss. The damaged side of the head did not regenerate back to its original form. Instead, it stabilized into a permanent deformity that became the primary identifier of the organism. Across the rest of the body, additional scarring has been consistently reported. These include deep gouges along the flanks, partial fractures in the carapace that have refused unevenly, and layered growth patterns where damaged plates appear to have been replaced over older structures rather than restored cleanly. The effect is cumulative. Old One Eye does not present as a pristine Tyranid organism fresh from the spawning pools. It presents as a bioform that has endured repeated high-intensity engagements and incorporated that damage into its continuing structure. This accumulation of visible trauma contributes directly to its recognition across multiple encounters, even when observed under poor conditions. Its limbs are built for close-quarters devastation. Old One Eye is most commonly described as bearing massive crushing claws, each capable of generating enough force to tear through armoured hulls, reinforced bulkheads, and dense infantry formations. These claws are not delicate instruments. They are blunt force implements designed to break, crush, and displace. The articulation of the joints allows for both wide, sweeping strikes and short, focused impacts, making the creature effective against both clustered targets and single heavy units. Reports of destroyed Leman Russ battle tanks during the Calth engagements support the conclusion that its upper limb strength exceeds standard Carnifex output, though precise measurement is not possible under combat conditions. In addition to its primary claws, Old One Eye possesses the secondary limbs common to Carnifex strains, used for stabilization, grappling, and maintaining forward momentum during charges. These limbs are shorter but heavily muscled, allowing the organism to maintain balance even when colliding with large obstacles or resisting counterforce. The lower body is similarly reinforced with powerful hind limbs capable of propelling its mass forward with surprising acceleration. This combination of weight and speed is central to its battlefield function. It does not rely on ranged bioweapons as its primary method of engagement. It closes distance and converts contact into destruction. The exoskeleton itself serves as both armor and structural support. The chitin plating is layered, with overlapping segments that distribute impact force across a wider surface area. In Old One Eye, these layers appear thicker and more irregular than in standard specimens, possibly due to repeated regrowth cycles. The surface is often described as dark, scarred, and uneven, with sections that reflect light differently due to varying densities of material. This irregularity does not weaken the armor. On the contrary, it may contribute to its effectiveness by disrupting predictable fracture patterns under sustained fire. Beneath the armor, the creature's internal systems demonstrate one of its most significant distinctive traits: accelerated regeneration. While all Tyranid organisms possess some capacity for biological repair, Old One Eye exhibits this trait at a level that fundamentally alters its threat profile. Wounds that would incapacitate or kill other bioforms have been observed closing over time, with damaged tissue replaced or reinforced. This process is not instantaneous. It does not prevent immediate injury. However, it allows the organism to recover from trauma that would otherwise remove it from the battlefield permanently. The incident involving its frozen body on Calth provides the clearest example. Even after prolonged inactivity and exposure, once thawed, its biological systems resumed function and initiated repair. This regenerative capacity extends to structural damage as well as soft tissue. Fractured carapace plates have been observed to refuse, though often with irregular patterns. This suggests that the regeneration process prioritizes functionality over symmetry. The result is a body that becomes increasingly asymmetrical over time, yet remains fully operational. From a tactical perspective, this makes Old One Eye difficult to evaluate during combat. Visible damage does not reliably indicate declining effectiveness. A creature that appears critically injured may still retain full offensive capability. Sensory function is another area where adaptation is evident. The loss of one eye would, in most organisms, result in reduced depth perception and situational awareness. Old One Eye compensates through a combination of enhanced remaining vision and non-visual sensory systems common to Tyranids. These include vibration detection through ground contact, chemical sensing of nearby organisms, and possibly low-level synaptic input when within range of other Tyranid creatures. The exact balance of these systems is not fully understood, but the creature's continued effectiveness in complex combat environments indicates that the loss of one eye has not significantly impaired its ability to track and engage targets. The absence of conventional gear in the human sense does not mean the absence of equipment. Tyranid bioforms are themselves their own weapons and tools, with every anatomical feature serving a purpose. In Old One Eye, this integration is complete. Its claws function as siege implements. Its carapace serves as heavy armor. Its musculature provides propulsion and impact force. Even its regenerative systems act as a form of defensive equipment, reducing the long-term consequences of damage. There is no separation between organism and armament. The creature is a fully integrated combat system. Behaviorally, Old One Eye operates within the broader logic of the Hive Mind, but displays patterns that have led observers to attribute a form of persistent identity to it. It does not exhibit personality in a human or even animal sense. There is no evidence of emotion, personal motivation, or individual decision-making independent of Tyranid instinct. However, its repeated appearances, consistent combat role, and identifiable physical traits create the impression of continuity. This impression is reinforced by its tendency to appear at critical points in engagements, often leading assaults or targeting high-value objectives. When isolated from direct synaptic control, as occurred after the initial invasion of Calth, Old One Eye continues to function as a highly aggressive predator. In such states, Carnifex organisms are known to revert to instinct-driven behaviour, focusing on immediate destruction and consumption. Old One Eye follows this pattern, but does so at a scale that draws other Tyranid remnants toward it. Smaller organisms have been observed converging in its vicinity, forming loose, unstructured groups that amplify its destructive impact. This suggests that even without centralized coordination, its presence acts as a focal point for Tyranid activity. Its engagement style is direct and uncompromising. Old One Eye does not maneuver for positional advantage in the way human commanders would understand it. Instead, it identifies targets and advances until contact is made. Obstacles are not navigated around, but through. Defensive positions are not probed but broken. This approach is consistent with Carnifex doctrine but is executed with a level of persistence that reduces the effectiveness of standard countermeasures. Units that rely on delaying tactics or layered defenses often find those measures insufficient when faced with an organism that does not disengage. There is also a pattern of targeting that has been noted in multiple reports. Old One Eye appears to prioritize heavily armored units, fortified structures, and concentrations of resistance. This may not be a conscious choice, but rather an emergent property of its role within Tyranid assault waves. By engaging the most durable targets, it clears the way for lighter organisms to exploit the resulting breaches. In this sense, its behavior aligns perfectly with the strategic needs of the Hive Mind, even when operating in isolation. From an Imperial perspective, the most unsettling aspect of Old One Eye is not any single trait but the combination of all of them. It is large, heavily armoured, and extremely strong. It can survive injuries that should be fatal. It can disappear and later return. It can operate both within and outside the direct control of the Hive Mind. Each of these characteristics is dangerous on its own. Together they create a threat that resists simple classification. It is not merely a weapon, nor is it merely an animal. It is a recurring problem, one that adapts, endures, and reappears. Over time, this has led to a subtle shift in how it is perceived. While Tyranid organisms are generally treated as interchangeable components of a larger force, Old One Eye is often referenced as though it were a singular entity with a continuous history. This does not reflect a change in its nature, but a change in human interpretation. Faced with a pattern that repeats across decades and across multiple war zones, Imperial observers have assigned it a form of identity as a way of understanding and tracking the threat. In practical terms, this means that any sighting of a scarred Carnifex with a destroyed eye socket is immediately treated with heightened concern. Whether the organism in question is the original Old One Eye, a regenerated form, or a separate bioform exhibiting similar traits, the response remains the same. The name carries with it the accumulated weight of previous encounters, shaping expectations and influencing tactical decisions before the creature is even engaged. This convergence of physical traits, integrated weapon systems, regenerative capability, and persistent battlefield presence defines Old One Eye more clearly than any attempt to assign it personality. It does not think in narratives. It does not act with intention as humans understand it. Yet through repeated survival and recognizable form, it occupies a space in Imperial records that few Tyranid organisms achieve. It is identified, remembered, and anticipated. The earliest confirmed achievements attributed to Old One Eye are inseparable from the wider assault of Hive Fleet Behemoth upon Calth. Within that campaign, the creature's role was not recorded as a named command element or a specialized variant with unique designation. Instead, its significance emerged through repeated battlefield outcomes. reports from armoured regiments and ultramarines formations consistently describe a single Carnifex bioform breaching fortified lines at critical points, collapsing defensive cohesion, and enabling follow-on Tyranid organisms to exploit the resulting openings. These actions, while aligned with standard Carnifex deployment doctrine, were executed with a degree of persistence and destructive consistency that elevated the creature beyond routine classification. One of the most frequently cited operational outcomes involves the destruction of multiple armoured vehicles, including Lehman Russ battle tanks, during the early stages of the Calth engagements. In conventional warfare terms, this represents the removal of heavy support assets that anchor defensive formations. When such assets are neutralized rapidly and repeatedly, the defensive structure begins to fail not only materially but psychologically. Old One-Eye's ability to engage and destroy these targets under sustained fire contributed directly to localized collapses in Imperial lines. This pattern, observed across multiple engagement zones, marks the first stage in its recognition as a distinct and recurring threat. Its second major achievement, though less conventional in military terms, lies in its survival under conditions that should have resulted in confirmed termination. The plasma shot that destroyed its eye and penetrated its cranial structure was, by all standard assessments, a fatal event. The subsequent recovery of the organism, whether through regenerative capability or incomplete destruction, represents a deviation from expected outcomes. This deviation forced Imperial forces to reconsider the reliability of kill confirmation when dealing with Tyranid heavy bioforms. In this sense, Old One-Eye's survival was not merely a biological anomaly, but a disruption of established combat assumptions. The incident involving its frozen body on Calth further expanded this disruption into a long-term strategic concern. The recovery and thawing of the organism by smugglers, followed by its rapid regeneration and immediate return to hostile activity, demonstrated that the creature's threat potential extended beyond active battlefield conditions. It could persist in a dormant state and resume function when environmental conditions allowed. This capacity transformed Old One-Eye from a wartime asset of the Hive Mind into a lingering hazard capable of reactivating after the primary invasion had ended. For Imperial authorities, this introduced a new category of risk: Tyranid organisms that could remain viable outside the temporal bounds of an active Hive fleet assault. Following its reactivation, Old One-Eye's actions across Calth represent a continuation of its earlier operational pattern, but in a more fragmented and unpredictable context. Without direct coordination from the broader Hive Mind, it operated as an independent destructive force. Convoys were intercepted and destroyed, settlements were overrun, and isolated military units were eliminated. These actions did not contribute to a larger strategic objective in the conventional sense. Instead, they extended the destructive footprint of the original invasion, maintaining a state of instability and loss long after the main Tyranid force had withdrawn. The engagement with Scout Sergeant Telian and his accompanying Ultramarines marks another significant point in the creature's recorded history. This encounter demonstrates both the potential and the limitations of precision-based countermeasures. Telian's ability to identify the creature's vulnerability and deliver a targeted shot into the damaged eye socket reflects the effectiveness of disciplined marksmanship and tactical awareness. The resulting incapacitation of Old One-Eye, forcing it into a ravine, temporarily neutralized the immediate threat. However, the absence of a recovered body once again prevented definitive confirmation of its destruction. This outcome reinforced the emerging pattern. Old One-Eye could be stopped, but it could not be reliably concluded. Across subsequent decades, reports of similarly scarred Carnifex organisms appearing in different war zones contributed to the expansion of Old One-Eye's perceived achievements. These reports are not all verifiable as encounters with a single continuous organism. However, the consistency of the identifying features, particularly the destroyed eye and heavily scarred carapace, led Imperial observers to associate these sightings with the same entity. As a result, Old One-Eye's record of achievements extends beyond confirmed engagements into a broader pattern of attributed activity. It becomes, in effect, a cumulative profile built from multiple encounters that share a recognizable signature. This accumulation of attributed actions includes the repeated breaching of fortified positions, the destruction of heavy vehicles and infrastructure, and the persistence of Tyranid threat presence in areas thought to have been secured. Whether these actions were performed by the original organism or by successive bioforms exhibiting similar traits, the effect on Imperial strategy is the same. Old One-Eye becomes a reference point for worst-case scenarios involving Carnifex-class organisms. Its name is invoked not as a specific unit designation, but as a shorthand for a type of threat that combines durability, aggression, and recurrence. In terms of organizational alignment, Old One-Eye operates entirely within the biological and strategic framework of the Tyranid Hive Mind. It does not possess rank, command authority, or independent allegiance. Its alignment is defined by its function as a bioengineered assault organism, created to serve the objectives of the Hive Mind during planetary invasions. Within this framework, its role is consistent with that of other Carnifexes, to act as a living siege engine, breaking enemy resistance through direct application of force. However, its periods of isolation from the Hive Mind, particularly on Calth after the withdrawal of Hive Fleet Behemoth, introduce a secondary mode of operation. In these conditions, Old One-Eye functions without centralized synaptic control, relying instead on instinct-driven behavior. This does not change its alignment in a broader sense. It remains a Tyranid organism, biologically and functionally tied to the Hive Mind's purpose. What changes is the level of coordination. Without direct guidance, its actions become less strategically integrated but no less destructive. During these isolated periods, the creature's presence has been observed to attract other Tyranid remnants, including smaller organisms left behind after the main invasion. This creates localized clusters of activity that resemble reduced-scale swarm behavior. In this context, Old One-Eye can be understood as a focal point rather than a commander. It does not issue orders, but its biological dominance influences the movement and actions of nearby organisms. This effect reinforces its role as a catalyst for continued conflict even in the absence of a full Hive fleet. From a broader Tyranid perspective, Old One-Eye's traits may represent an early or particularly successful expression of adaptive evolution. Its regenerative capabilities in particular align with later developments observed in other Hive fleets, where enhanced durability and recovery have become more widespread among heavy bioforms. If Old One-Eye was indeed an early manifestation of such traits, its operational history provides a case study in the effectiveness of these adaptations. Its repeated survival and continued impact across multiple engagements demonstrate the strategic value of resilience in prolonged conflicts. The conclusion of Chapter 1 requires a careful balance between confirmed fact and observed pattern. Old One-Eye is, at its core, a Carnifex of exceptional resilience and destructive capability. Its notable achievements include the breaching of fortified defences during the assault on Calth, the destruction of armoured units, and the continuation of hostile activity long after the initial invasion. Its survival under conditions that should have resulted in termination has transformed it from a standard bioform into a recurring subject of Imperial concern. Its organizational alignment remains constant. It is a component of the Tyranid war machine, shaped by the Hive Mind's strategic requirements. Yet its periods of isolation reveal that even without direct control, its function as an agent of destruction persists. This duality, operating both as part of a coordinated swarm and as an independent threat, contributes to its unique position within Tyranid lore. Ultimately, Old One-Eye's significance lies not in any single engagement, but in the pattern it establishes. It demonstrates that within the Tyranid arsenal, certain organisms can transcend their initial deployment parameters, continuing to influence conflict across time and space. Whether encountered as a singular enduring entity, or as a recurring form reproduced by the Hive Mind, the effect is the same. It challenges the assumption that a battle ends when the enemy falls. In Imperial records, this challenge is preserved as a name, a set of identifying features, and a series of engagements that resist final closure. Old One Eye remains, above all else, an unresolved problem. Initial administratum compilations concerning Old One Eye do not treat the organism as an isolated anomaly, but as a recurring data inconsistency within Tyranid engagement records. Early cross-referencing of battlefield reports revealed a pattern that did not conform to standard casualty tracking. Multiple engagements, separated by years and in some cases by entire sectors, described a Carnifex-class organism bearing near identical structural damage and exhibiting comparable levels of resilience. The probability of identical damage patterns occurring across unrelated bioforms was considered low. The probability of incomplete or inaccurate reporting was considered high. The resulting classification placed Old One Eye within a category of persistent threat signatures, a designation used when the same hostile profile appears repeatedly despite prior confirmed neutralization. Administratum analysts approached the problem through aggregation rather than assumption. Combat logs from Calth, Ultramar and adjacent systems were examined for matching descriptors. Keywords associated with the subject included unilateral cranial damage, abnormal regeneration, disproportionate armored target destruction, and repeated loss of kill confirmation. These descriptors were not unique individually. Combined, they formed a recognizable pattern. The conclusion reached was not that a single organism had definitively survived across all reported incidents, but that the pattern itself warranted independent tracking. In practical terms, Old One Eye became both a possible individual entity and a classification marker for a specific type of Carnifex threat. From a logistical standpoint, this classification had immediate implications. Units operating in Tyranid contested zones were advised to treat any Carnifex exhibiting significant cranial damage and continued functionality as a high-priority target. Standard engagement protocols were considered insufficient in isolation. Reports emphasized the necessity of sustained fire, redundancy in targeting, and post-engagement verification beyond visual confirmation. This shift reflects a broader administratum principle. When a threat cannot be reliably eliminated, it must be treated as ongoing regardless of apparent outcome. Mechanicus observations approached the same data from a different angle. Where the administratum focused on pattern recognition and operational response, the Adeptus Mechanicus examined the biological and mechanical implications of Old One Eye's reported capabilities. The most significant point of interest was its regenerative function. While Tyranid organisms are known to possess adaptive and self-repairing tissue, the degree of recovery attributed to Old One Eye exceeded baseline expectations. Tissue regrowth, following catastrophic cranial penetration, combined with the restoration of systemic function after prolonged freezing, suggested either an extreme expression of known Tyranid biology or the presence of a specialized adaptation. Mechanicus biologist logs describe this capability in terms of cellular redundancy and accelerated reconstruction. The hypothesis proposes that Old One Eye's internal systems may include distributed neural structures or auxiliary processing nodes, allowing critical functions to continue even after significant damage to primary centers. This would explain the creature's ability to survive injuries that disrupt central nervous systems in other organisms. Additionally, the regenerative process appears to prioritize rapid restoration of function over structural precision, resulting in the uneven and layered growth patterns observed in its carapace and cranial structure. Another area of interest for the Mechanicus is the apparent stability of these adaptations. Tyranid organisms are often described as highly specialized for specific roles, with variations introduced as needed by the Hive Mind. However, Old One Eye's traits appear consistent across multiple reported encounters. This consistency suggests either that the organism represents a stable evolutionary configuration, or that the Hive Mind has replicated its design with minimal variation. In either case, the implication is significant. A stable configuration indicates that the traits observed in Old One Eye are not experimental anomalies but viable solutions within Tyranid biological engineering. Administratum records also note the psychological impact associated with repeated sightings. While official documentation avoids emotive language, there is acknowledgement that units encountering Old One Eye or similar organisms exhibit increased caution and, in some cases, reduced confidence in standard engagement outcomes. This effect is not attributed to superstition but to accumulated experience. When a target has been reported as destroyed multiple times and continues to reappear, the reliability of conventional expectations is undermined. To counter this, briefing materials emphasize procedural rigor and discourage assumptions based on prior encounters. Mechanicus assessments extend beyond the organism itself to its interaction with surrounding Tyranid bioforms. Observations from Calth and subsequent engagements indicate that Old One Eye's presence correlates with increased activity among lesser Tyranid organisms, even in the absence of direct synaptic control. This phenomenon is interpreted as a form of localized influence, where the organism's biological signals or sheer dominance affect the behavior of nearby bioforms. While not equivalent to synapse command, this influence is sufficient to create temporary concentrations of hostile activity. For field operations, this means that the presence of Old One Eye should be treated as an indicator of broader Tyranid engagement potential, regardless of initial contact scale. Notable findings from combined Administratum and Mechanicus analysis include the following conclusions, presented here in narrative form rather than enumeration. Old One Eye represents either a singular persistent organism or a reproducible Tyranid design characterized by extreme resilience and identifiable structural damage. Its regenerative capabilities challenge standard assumptions regarding the lethality of critical injuries. Its repeated appearances across multiple engagements necessitate independent tracking as a persistent threat signature. Its presence influences the behavior of surrounding Tyranid organisms, increasing the likelihood of localized escalation. Finally, its impact on Imperial operational expectations requires adjustments to engagement protocols, emphasizing redundancy, verification, and sustained response. There is also a growing body of speculation within Mechanicus circles regarding the broader implications of Old One Eye's traits. Some theorize that it represents an early stage in the development of more advanced Carnifex strains, particularly those associated with later hive fleets such as Leviathan. In this view, Old One Eye is not an outlier but a precursor, demonstrating the effectiveness of enhanced regeneration and structural durability. Others argue that its persistence is less a matter of replication and more a consequence of exceptional survivability, with the same organism continuing to reappear over extended periods. Both interpretations remain unconfirmed, but each carries strategic implications. If the traits are reproducible, similar threats may become more common. If the organism is singular, its continued survival indicates a level of resilience that must be accounted for in all future engagements. Administratum cross-sector reports further note that sightings attributed to Old One Eye often coincide with periods of heightened Tyranid activity, though not always with full-scale invasions. This suggests that the organism may operate effectively both within and on the periphery of major hive fleet movements. Its ability to function outside direct synaptic networks allows it to persist in environments where other Tyranid organisms would degrade or become inactive. This persistence extends the operational reach of the Tyranid threat beyond the immediate presence of a hive fleet. From a resource allocation perspective, this creates complications. Worlds previously classified as cleared or low risk may still harbour active Tyranid bioforms capable of significant damage. Old One Eye serves as a primary example of this risk. As a result, Administratum guidelines increasingly emphasize long-term monitoring and periodic re-evaluation of post-invasion environments. The cost of such monitoring is considerable, but the alternative, untracked re-emergence of high-impact organisms, is considered unacceptable. Mechanicus documentation also addresses the structural integrity of Old One Eye's carapace in relation to its regenerative processes. Analysis suggests that repeated cycles of damage and repair may result in increased density and irregular layering, effectively strengthening the organism over time. This would explain reports of later encounters where the creature appears more resistant to penetration than during its initial engagements. If accurate, this indicates a form of cumulative adaptation, where survival through damage leads to incremental improvements in defensive capability. In summary, the combined perspectives of the Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus frame Old One-Eye not as a singular curiosity, but as a case study in Tyranid persistence and adaptability. The Administratum focuses on its implications for record-keeping, threat classification, and operational procedure, emphasizing the need for consistent tracking and cautious engagement. The Mechanicus examines the biological mechanisms underlying its capabilities, identifying potential evolutionary significance and structural adaptation. Together, these perspectives produce a unified assessment. Old One-Eye is a high-priority Carnifex-class threat characterized by identifiable damage, exceptional regenerative capacity, and repeated reappearance across multiple engagements. Whether singular or replicated, it represents a deviation from expected Tyranid behavior patterns that must be accounted for in both strategic planning and field operations. The data does not resolve the question of identity. It does, however, establish a clear directive. Any organism matching the profile associated with Old One-Eye is to be treated not as an isolated encounter, but as part of an ongoing and unresolved pattern. Administratum records concerning direct engagements with Old One-Eye are structured less around narrative and more around incident consolidation. Individual battle reports, when viewed in isolation, describe encounters with a heavily damaged Carnifex exhibiting abnormal resilience and aggressive assault behavior. When these reports are combined across multiple campaigns, a pattern of personal engagement emerges that differs from standard Tyranid contact profiles. Old One-Eye is not simply encountered as part of a mass wave, it is frequently identified at decisive points within engagements, where the outcome of localized combat hinges on the collapse or survival of a defensive position. Field reports from Calth remain the most detailed in terms of direct contact. Units engage the organism under conditions of sustained Tyranid pressure, with Old One-Eye operating at the forefront of breach attempts. Armored elements reported direct collisions resulting in catastrophic damage, while infantry accounts describe close-range engagements where standard anti-armor weapons proved insufficient without concentrated fire. These engagements established the baseline for all subsequent encounters. Old One-Eye closes distance rapidly, absorbs initial resistance, and converts proximity into structural and personnel losses. Later, Administratum compilations highlight similar engagement patterns in other regions, though with reduced clarity due to the fragmented nature of reporting. In several cases, commanders noted the presence of a Carnifex matching Old One-Eye's profile during critical phases of defensive operations. These sightings often coincided with the failure of fortified positions or the loss of key logistical nodes. While not every report can be verified as the same organism, the recurrence of these conditions reinforces the perception of Old One-Eye as a catalyst for engagement escalation. From a personal engagement perspective, one of the most significant documented interactions remains the confrontation involving Scout Sergeant Telian. Mechanicus analysis of this event focuses on the precision required to exploit the organism's known vulnerability. The shot delivered into the damaged eye socket demonstrates that, despite its resilience, Old One-Eye retains identifiable weak points. However, the outcome of the engagement, with the organism falling into a ravine and no body recovered, underscores the limitations of even successful tactical execution. The inability to confirm termination transforms a tactical success into a strategic uncertainty. Administratum commentary on such engagements emphasizes the importance of redundancy. Units are advised not to rely on single-point vulnerabilities as definitive solutions. Instead, engagement protocols recommend layered responses, combining precision strikes with sustained fire and environmental containment where possible. The goal is not merely to incapacitate, but to ensure that the organism cannot recover or re-emerge. In practice, this level of response is difficult to achieve under active combat conditions, particularly when facing concurrent Tyranid threats. The political and military importance of Old One-Eye extends beyond its immediate battlefield impact. Within the Administratum, the organism is treated as a reference case for the broader challenges posed by Tyranid adaptability. Its repeated appearances and apparent survivability complicate efforts to produce accurate threat assessments and post-engagement reports. In a system that relies on documentation and verification, the existence of a target that resists final classification introduces persistent uncertainty. This uncertainty has practical consequences. Resource allocation decisions, particularly in regions previously affected by Tyranid invasions, must account for the possibility of re-emergent threats. Worlds declared secure may still harbour organisms capable of significant damage. Old One-Eye serves as a primary example in internal briefings, illustrating the risks associated with premature de-escalation. As a result, administratum policies increasingly favour extended monitoring and the maintenance of rapid response capabilities in affected sectors. From a military standpoint, Old One-Eye influences both tactical planning and training doctrine. Units operating in Tyranid contested environments are briefed on the characteristics associated with the organism, including its resilience, regenerative capacity, and tendency to target heavily armoured assets. This briefing is not intended to elevate the creature beyond its biological classification, but to ensure that personnel recognise the limitations of standard engagement expectations. The emphasis is on preparedness rather than alarm. Mechanicus perspectives on the organism's importance are framed in terms of biological and technological value. Old One-Eye represents a data point in the ongoing study of Tyranid bioengineering, particularly in the area of regenerative adaptation. The ability to recover from catastrophic injury and resume function after extended dormancy suggests mechanisms that could have broader applications within Tyranid evolutionary pathways. For the Mechanicus, understanding these mechanisms is critical to developing effective countermeasures. Speculative Mechanicus logs propose that Old One-Eye's regenerative traits may involve a combination of rapid cellular replication, distributed neural processing, and adaptive structural reinforcement. If these traits can be isolated and analysed, they may provide insight into how Tyranid organisms maintain operational integrity under extreme conditions. However, the acquisition of viable samples presents significant challenges. The organism's size, aggression, and tendency to avoid definitive termination make controlled study impractical under current conditions. There is also consideration of the organism's value as a predictive indicator. Mechanicus analysts note that traits observed in Old One-Eye appear in more standardized forms among later Tyranid bioforms, particularly those associated with Hive Fleet Leviathan. This suggests that the characteristics exhibited by Old One-Eye may represent an early stage in a broader evolutionary trend. If accurate, monitoring such organisms provides advance warning of future developments within Tyranid forces. Administratum and Mechanicus perspectives converge on the subject of strategic value. Old One-Eye is not valuable in the sense of an asset to be captured or utilized. Its value lies in what it reveals about the enemy. Each confirmed or suspected encounter contributes to a growing body of data regarding Tyranid resilience, adaptation, and operational persistence. This data informs both defensive planning and long-term strategic considerations. At the same time, the organism's impact on Imperial perception cannot be ignored. While official doctrine avoids attributing symbolic significance to individual Tyranid organisms, the repeated reference to Old One-Eye in reports and briefings indicates a level of recognition that influences how threats are understood. It becomes a point of reference, a way of conceptualizing a category of danger that is otherwise diffuse and difficult to define. This conceptual role carries both benefits and risks. On one hand, it provides a clear example that can be used in training and planning, helping personnel understand the nature of Tyranid persistence. On the other, it risks oversimplification, encouraging the assumption that all similar threats will conform to the same pattern. Administratum guidelines therefore stress the importance of treating Old One-Eye as an illustrative case rather than a comprehensive model. In terms of direct military importance, the organism's ability to disrupt operations at critical moments remains its most significant attribute. Whether breaching defenses, destroying key assets, or drawing attention and resources away from other threats, Old One-Eye functions as a force multiplier for Tyranid activity. Its presence alters the dynamics of engagements, forcing commanders to adapt in real time and often under unfavourable conditions. Mechanicus evaluations reinforce this assessment by highlighting the efficiency of its design. As a single organism, it combines durability, offensive capability, and regenerative resilience in a way that maximizes its impact relative to its number. This efficiency aligns with the broader Tyranid approach to warfare, where biological forms are optimized for specific roles within a larger system. Old One-Eye exemplifies this optimization, demonstrating how a single, well-adapted organism can influence the outcome of engagements disproportionate to its scale. The convergence of these factors leads to a unified conclusion within Administratum and Mechanicus documentation. Old One-Eye is a high-impact Tyranid organism whose significance extends beyond individual encounters. Its personal engagements provide insight into its operational behaviour. Its political and military importance reflects the challenges it poses to Imperial systems, and its subject value lies in the data it contributes to the understanding of Tyranid evolution and strategy. It remains, in all recorded respects, a problem that has not been fully resolved. Administratum or records referencing Old One-Eye are structured around convergence rather than continuity. There is no single uninterrupted campaign trail that can be followed from first sighting to final engagement. Instead, the data forms a layered archive of incidents distributed across time, with each record contributing to a composite understanding of the subject's operational footprint. The earliest verified entries remain tied to the Calth conflict during the Tyranid incursion of Hive Fleet Behemoth. From this point onward, subsequent reports are appended based on descriptive correlation rather than confirmed identity, producing a record that reflects both confirmed encounters and attributed activity. The Calth campaign provides the clearest baseline. Within this theatre, Old One-Eye is documented as a primary breaching organism during multiple engagements. Armoured columns reported loss rates exceeding standard projections when the creature was present, with Lehman Russ battle tanks and support vehicles destroyed in rapid succession. Infantry formations recorded similar disruption, with defensive lines collapsing under combined pressure from massed Tyranid organisms and the focused assault of the Carnifex. The result of these engagements was a measurable increase in territorial loss and a corresponding delay in stabilisation efforts across affected zones. Administratum summaries of the Calth records emphasise the relationship between Old One-Eye's presence and the speed of defensive failure. Where standard Carnifex organisms contributed to attrition over time, this particular specimen accelerated the process. Breaches occurred earlier, counterattacks were less effective, and recovery of lost positions required significantly greater resource expenditure. These outcomes are not attributed solely to the organism, but its presence is consistently identified as a contributing factor in the escalation of losses. Following the withdrawal of Hive Fleet Behemoth, the war record shifts from large-scale engagements to localized incidents. Reports from Calth describe continued destruction, attributed to a Carnifex matching Old One-Eye's profile. Convoys were ambushed, habdomes were breached, and isolated military detachments were eliminated. These incidents, while smaller in scale, extended the operational impact of the original invasion. Administratum classification of this phase designates it as residual conflict, where remaining hostile elements continue to generate losses after the primary campaign has concluded. Mechanicus logs from this period focus on the anomaly presented by the organism's persistence. The recovery of its frozen body and subsequent reactivation are treated as a critical data point. From a war record perspective, this event marks the transition of Old One-Eye from a combatant within a defined campaign to a recurring hazard. It demonstrates that Tyranid bioforms, under certain conditions, can survive beyond expected operational timelines and re-enter active conflict without external reinforcement. The engagement involving Scout Sergeant Telian represents a midpoint in the war record, bridging the initial campaign and later attributed sightings. Administratum analysis categorizes this encounter as a partial neutralization event. The organism was incapacitated and removed from immediate engagement, but the absence of a recovered body prevents classification as a confirmed kill. This distinction is significant within Imperial record keeping. A partial neutralization does not remove the subject from future threat assessments. Instead, it reinforces the need for continued monitoring. Subsequent war records become increasingly fragmented. Reports from Ultramar and neighbouring sectors describe encounters with Carnifex organisms bearing similar damage patterns and exhibiting comparable resilience. These reports often occur during Tyranid incursions of varying scale, including both major Hive fleet operations and smaller splinter fleet actions. In each case, the presence of such an organism correlates with intensified local destruction, particularly in areas involving fortified positions or critical infrastructure. Administrator methodology for integrating these reports relies on probabilistic assessment. Each sighting is evaluated based on the degree of similarity to the established profile of Old One Eye. High confidence matches are incorporated into the primary record, while lower confidence reports are retained as supplementary data. This approach acknowledges the limitations of verification while preserving the broader pattern. The result is a war record that does not claim absolute continuity, but presents a consistent narrative of recurring threat. Mechanicus analysis of these later engagements highlights the possibility of trait propagation. The repeated appearance of similar organisms suggests that the characteristics associated with Old One Eye may not be unique to a single entity. Instead, they may represent a successful biological configuration replicated by the Hive Mind. If this is the case, the war record reflects not the movements of one organism, but the deployment of a specific design across multiple theatres. This interpretation aligns with observations of later Tyranid forces, particularly those associated with Hive Fleet Leviathan, where enhanced regenerative capabilities and increased durability are more commonly observed among heavy bioforms. Old One Eye, in this context, becomes an early instance of a broader evolutionary trend. Its war record therefore serves as both a historical account and a predictive indicator. Results derived from administratum analysis of these engagements focus on operational impact. Encounters involving Old One Eye or similar organisms consistently result in elevated casualty rates, increased material loss, and prolonged engagement duration. Defensive strategies that rely on attrition or containment prove less effective, as the organism's resilience allows it to sustain pressure beyond expected limits. Offensive strategies, particularly those involving precision targeting of vulnerabilities, can achieve temporary success but do not guarantee permanent resolution. Mechanicus conclusions reinforce these findings by emphasizing the efficiency of the organism's design. The combination of heavy armor, high-impact melee capability, and regenerative resilience creates a unit that maximizes damage output while minimizing vulnerability. From a purely functional perspective, this represents an optimal configuration for its intended role within Tyranid assault doctrine. The war record demonstrates that even a single organism of this type can alter the outcome of localized engagements. There's also a noted effect on engagement tempo. The presence of Old One Eye tends to accelerate the pace of conflict. Defensive lines are breached more quickly, forcing rapid redeployment and reducing the time available for strategic planning. This acceleration places additional strain on command structures and logistical support, compounding the direct physical damage caused by the organism. In this way, its impact extends beyond immediate combat to influence the broader conduct of operations. From a results-oriented perspective, the most significant conclusion is the absence of a definitive termination record. Despite multiple engagements, including those involving high-precision strikes and concentrated fire, there is no confirmed instance in which Old One Eye has been conclusively destroyed and verified as such. This absence is not interpreted as proof of invulnerability, but as evidence of the limitations inherent in current engagement and verification protocols. Administratum directives derived from this conclusion emphasize the need for revised standards in kill confirmation when dealing with Tyranid heavy bioforms. Visual confirmation is considered insufficient. Where possible, physical verification and post-engagement analysis are required. In many combat scenarios, these requirements cannot be met, leading to a default assumption of continued threat. This assumption influences both immediate tactical decisions and long-term strategic planning. Mechanicus recommendations focus on the development of countermeasures tailored to the organism's observed traits. These include increased emphasis on weapons capable of delivering sustained high-energy output, methods for disrupting regenerative processes, and techniques for ensuring complete structural destruction. While some of these measures have been implemented in limited contexts, their effectiveness against organisms matching Old One Eye's profile remains variable. The concluding assessment of Chapter 2 integrates these observations into a unified perspective. Old One Eye, as recorded within Administratum and Mechanicus archives, represents a persistent and adaptive threat whose war record is defined by repeated engagement without definitive resolution. Its presence in multiple campaigns, whether as a singular entity or as a replicated design, demonstrates the capacity of Tyranid forces to produce organisms that challenge conventional assumptions of warfare. Its impact on battles is measurable in terms of increased losses and accelerated defensive collapse. Its influence on Imperial systems extends to record-keeping, resource allocation, and doctrinal development. Its biological characteristics provide insight into Tyranid evolution and the potential for future adaptations. The absence of closure within its war record is not treated as an anomaly to be dismissed, but as a condition to be managed. Old One Eye is therefore retained within active threat classifications, its profile maintained and updated as new data becomes available. Until a confirmed and verifiable termination is achieved, it remains part of the operational landscape. In Administratum and Mechanicus terms, this is the final and most relevant conclusion. The subject is not resolved. Inquisition records concerning Old One Eye begin from a position of controlled skepticism. Unlike Administratum compilations, which prioritize pattern consistency, and Mechanicus analyses, which seek biological explanation, inquisitorial documentation is structured around the possibility of misinterpretation, concealment, and systemic error. The subject is not immediately accepted as a singular persistent organism. Instead, it is treated as a recurring anomaly requiring layered verification, including the examination of unreliable testimony, contradictory reports, and the potential for external influence on recorded data. Initial impressions within Ordo Xenos archives describe Old One Eye as a designation of convenience, applied to a series of Tyranid encounters sharing common features. These features include a destroyed cranial eye socket, extensive scar tissue, and abnormal regenerative capability. The consistency of these traits across multiple reports is acknowledged, but not taken at face value. Inquisitorial methodology requires the consideration of alternative explanations, including coincidental similarity, misidentification under combat conditions, and the influence of expectation on perception. When soldiers are briefed on a specific threat profile, they are more likely to interpret ambiguous observations in a way that confirms that profile. Despite this caution, Inquisition analysts do not dismiss the pattern. Instead, they classify it as a persistent anomaly cluster, a term used when multiple independent reports converge on a shared description without definitive proof of singular identity. This classification allows for continued investigation without committing to a fixed interpretation. It also ensures that the subject remains within active surveillance parameters, with new data continuously compared against existing records. Observational data collected by inquisitorial agents often diverges slightly from Administratum summaries. While the broader characteristics remain consistent, there is greater emphasis on behavioral irregularities. Several reports note that organisms identified as Old One Eye exhibit moments of apparent directional focus that exceed what would be expected from instinct-driven Carnifex behavior. These moments are not sustained and do not indicate independent cognition. However, they suggest a level of responsiveness that may reflect either residual synaptic influence or an enhanced internal processing capability. This observation leads to one of the more persistent lines of inquisitorial inquiry. Some analysts propose that Old One Eye may retain fragments of synaptic connection, even when operating outside the immediate range of a Hive fleet's control network. This does not imply autonomy in the human sense, but rather a reduced or indirect link that allows for limited coordination or prioritization. Evidence supporting this theory is circumstantial, based on patterns of movement and target selection that appear more structured than purely instinctual behavior would suggest. Other inquisitors reject this interpretation, arguing that the observed behavior can be explained by the organism's role and biological design. Carnifex strains are engineered for direct assault, and their targeting of heavily defended positions may simply reflect an inherent prioritization of resistance points. In this view, Old One-Eye's actions do not indicate enhanced cognition, but rather the effective execution of a predefined behavioral template. The disagreement remains unresolved, with both interpretations retained within the archive as viable possibilities. Conspiracy findings within Inquisition records extend beyond biological speculation into the realm of information integrity. One recurring concern is the possibility that Old One-Eye's legend has been amplified through cumulative reporting errors. As accounts are copied, summarized, and redistributed across departments, details may become standardized, creating the illusion of consistency where none originally existed. This process, known within inquisitorial analysis as narrative convergence, can produce a coherent profile from disparate and unrelated events. To address this possibility, inquisitorial teams have conducted comparative reviews of original field reports, seeking variations in description that may have been lost in later summaries. These reviews have identified minor discrepancies in size estimates, carapace coloration, and specific damage patterns. However, the core identifying feature, the destroyed eye socket, remains consistent across the majority of accounts. This consistency reduces, but does not eliminate, the likelihood that the subject is purely a construct of converging narratives. Another line of inquiry considers the potential for deliberate misinformation. In a galaxy where information is both a weapon and a vulnerability, the idea that reports could be altered, suppressed, or fabricated cannot be dismissed. Some inquisitors have raised the possibility that the repeated appearance of Old One-Eye may be the result of manipulated records, either to conceal other activities or to create a predictable narrative within Imperial intelligence systems. No direct evidence supports this theory, but its inclusion reflects the Inquisition's mandate to consider all plausible avenues. More grounded, though still unconfirmed, is the theory that Old One-Eye represents not a single organism, but a recurring Tyranid adaptation deliberately reproduced by the Hive Mind. In this interpretation, the damaged eye is not a random injury but a retained feature, either because it does not impede function or because it serves an unknown purpose. The repetition of this feature across multiple organisms would create the impression of a single persistent entity, while actually representing a series of distinct bioforms sharing a common design. This theory aligns with known Tyranid behavior, where successful traits are replicated and refined across generations. However, it raises additional questions. If the damaged eye is a retained feature, why does it persist despite its apparent disadvantage? One possibility is that the loss of the eye is compensated by other sensory systems, rendering it functionally irrelevant. Another is that the damage itself may trigger or enhance the regenerative processes that define the organism's resilience. These possibilities remain speculative, with no definitive mechanism identified. Inquisitorial observations also consider the psychological dimension of Old One-Eye's presence. While the Inquisition does not formally engage in morale analysis, it recognizes that perception influences behavior. Reports indicate that units encountering organisms identified as Old One-Eye exhibit heightened caution and, in some cases, hesitation in engagement. This response is not attributed to fear in a conventional sense, but to uncertainty regarding the effectiveness of standard tactics. When a target is believed to be capable of returning after apparent destruction, the confidence underlying those tactics is diminished. This effect is not limited to frontline units. Command-level decisions may also be influenced by the presence of a known persistent threat. Resource allocation, engagement priorities, and withdrawal thresholds can all be affected by the expectation that an encounter with Old One-Eye will require disproportionate effort to resolve. In this way, the subject's influence extends beyond physical damage into the realm of strategic perception. A further observation concerns the temporal distribution of sightings. Inquisition records note that reports attributed to Old One-Eye often occur in the aftermath of Tyranid incursions, rather than during their peak intensity. This pattern suggests that the organism, or organisms sharing its profile, may be particularly effective in post-invasion environments. Such environments are characterized by reduced coordination, fragmented defenses, and the presence of isolated Tyranid remnants. In this context, Old One-Eye's resilience and independence become significant advantages. This observation supports a broader hypothesis that Old One-Eye functions as a form of residual enforcement within Tyranid strategy. While the main Hive fleet conducts large-scale consumption, organisms like Old One-Eye may persist to ensure that remaining resistance is eliminated and that the affected region remains destabilized. This role is not formally documented within Tyranid doctrine, but it is consistent with the observed pattern of continued activity following major invasions. The cumulative effect of these impressions, observations, and speculative findings is a profile that resists simplification. Old One-Eye cannot be conclusively defined as a singular entity, nor can it be dismissed as a series of unrelated organisms. It occupies an intermediate position where consistent features and recurring behavior create the appearance of continuity without definitive proof. From an Inquisition perspective, this ambiguity is not a weakness, but a condition to be managed. The subject is maintained within active investigation status, with all new reports subjected to cross-referencing and critical analysis. No single theory is allowed to dominate the interpretation of data. Instead, multiple hypotheses are retained simultaneously, each evaluated against incoming evidence. The guiding principle is caution. Whether Old One-Eye is one organism, many, or something in between, the threat it represents is real and demonstrable. Its ability to survive, reappear, and influence engagements has been recorded across multiple independent sources. Until a definitive explanation is established, it remains classified as an unresolved anomaly within Tyranid studies. In inquisitorial terms, this classification carries a specific implication. The subject is not closed. Inquisition interrogative records concerning Old One-Eye are constructed from indirect sources rather than controlled capture or direct containment. No verified instance exists in which the organism has been secured for sustained study or subjected to formal interrogation in the conventional sense. As a result, all findings are derived from the questioning of survivors, the examination of recovered data fragments, and the reconstruction of events through cross-reference testimony. This limitation is acknowledged at the outset of every compiled dossier, and it shapes the manner in which conclusions are drawn. Information is treated as provisional, weighted according to consistency and corroboration, rather than assumed accuracy. Interrogations conducted by Ordo Xenot agents focus primarily on individuals who have survived close-range encounters. These include Astra Militarum personnel, Ultramarines elements, and civilian witnesses from affected regions such as Calth. The reliability of such testimony varies. Combat stress, environmental interference, and the inherent difficulty of observing Tyranid organisms under active engagement conditions introduce distortion. However, when multiple accounts align on specific details, those details are elevated within the record. One recurring observation across interrogations is the perception of continuity. Survivors frequently describe the organism not as an instance of a Carnifex, but as the same entity encountered in prior engagements. This perception persists even among individuals with no prior exposure to briefing materials on Old One-Eye. Inquisitorial analysts treat this as a significant anomaly. While it may be explained by the distinctive physical damage associated with the organism, the consistency of the identification suggests a level of recognizability that exceeds typical battlefield conditions. Further interrogation reveals consistent descriptions of engagement dynamics. Witnesses report that the organism exhibits a form of directed aggression, focusing on specific targets with sustained attention. These targets often include armored vehicles, fortified structures, or individuals identified as command elements. While such targeting aligns with known Carnifex behavior, The degree of persistence noted in these accounts is unusual. In several cases, survivors describe the organism continuing its assault on a single objective despite the presence of multiple alternative targets. This behavior is recorded as an anomaly, as it suggests either a prioritization mechanism beyond basic instinct or an external influence guiding its actions. Inquisitorial questioning also explores the organism's response to injury. Survivors consistently report that Old One-Eye does not exhibit conventional signs of incapacitation when damaged. Even after sustaining injuries that would disable other Tyranid organisms, it continues to function, often with no observable reduction in aggression. In some accounts, the creature appears to increase its activity following significant damage, though this may reflect the perception of witnesses rather than a measurable change in behavior. Regardless, the inability to reliably interpret damage as a reduction in threat level complicates engagement and contributes to the perception of the organism as effectively unkillable. Anomalies extend beyond behavior into the temporal aspects of reported encounters. Interrogation logs reveal instances where sightings attributed to Old One-Eye occur within timeframes that challenge the assumption of a single continuous organism. In certain cases, reports from different systems suggest near-simultaneous appearances of a Carnifex matching the subject's profile. These reports are not uniformly verified, and some may result from misidentification. However, their existence introduces the possibility that multiple organisms share the defining characteristics associated with Old One-Eye. This possibility is further supported by discrepancies identified during detailed questioning. While the destroyed eye socket remains a constant feature, variations in size, movement patterns, and specific scarring have been noted. These differences are subtle and often require careful comparison to detect. Inquisitorial analysts interpret them in two primary ways. One interpretation suggests that the organism undergoes continuous physical change through repeated damage and regeneration, resulting in gradual variation over time. The alternative interpretation proposes that multiple organisms, each bearing similar traits, are being encountered and collectively identified under a single designation. Interrogative findings also address the phenomenon of post-engagement absence. In numerous cases, witnesses report the apparent defeat of the organism, followed by the inability to locate its body. This absence is not always immediate. In some instances, the creature is observed falling, becoming immobilized, or disappearing from active engagement. Subsequent search efforts fail to recover remains. This pattern is consistent enough to be classified as a recurring anomaly. Possible explanations include rapid regeneration combined with withdrawal, environmental concealment, or misinterpretation of the organism's condition at the time of disengagement. Personal encounters recorded by inquisitorial agents provide additional context, though they remain limited in number. Agents operating in Tyranid contested regions have documented indirect contact with the aftermath of the organism's activity. These encounters are characterized by extensive structural damage, high casualty rates, and the presence of Tyranid remnants drawn to the site. In a smaller number of cases, agents have observed the organism directly, though such observations are typically brief and conducted under conditions that preclude detailed study. One such encounter, recorded in a restricted Ordo Xenos file, describes an agent observing a Carnifex matching Old One-Eye's profile during a post-invasion sweep. The organism was engaged by a combined force of Imperial Guard and Space Marines. According to the report, it sustained multiple high-energy impacts, including plasma and melter fire, yet continued to advance. The agent notes a moment in which the creature paused, reoriented, and resumed its assault with increased intensity. This observation is marked as anomalous, as it suggests a degree of responsiveness not fully accounted for by known Carnifex behavior. Interrogation of surviving participants from this engagement reinforces the perception of resilience. Witnesses describe the organism as unresponsive to damage and continuing regardless of condition. These descriptions are not taken literally, but are understood to reflect the difficulty of assessing its operational state. When standard indicators of incapacitation fail to produce expected results, the perception of invulnerability emerges. Inquisitorial analysis also considers the possibility of cognitive bias influencing these accounts. The reputation of Old One Eye, once established, may shape how encounters are perceived and reported. Witnesses who believe they are facing a persistent and resilient entity may interpret events in a way that reinforces that belief. This does not invalidate the observations, but requires that they be evaluated within the context of expectation. Another area of interrogative focus is the interaction between Old One Eye and other Tyranid organisms. Survivors frequently report that lesser bioforms converge on the creature's location, even in the absence of a visible synaptic leader. This convergence is not orderly, but appears driven by a combination of proximity and biological signaling. The result is a localized increase in Tyranid activity that amplifies the impact of the organism's presence. Inquisitorial analysts classify this as a secondary effect, where the primary threat generates additional hazards through indirect influence. The cumulative findings from interrogation and personal encounters lead to a set of unresolved anomalies. The first is the question of identity, whether Old One Eye is a singular organism or a recurring configuration. The second is the mechanism underlying its regenerative capacity and apparent resistance to fatal injury. The third is the nature of its targeting behavior, specifically whether it reflects advanced processing or an emergent property of its design. The fourth is the cause of its repeated disappearance following apparent defeat. None of these anomalies have been conclusively resolved. Each remains under active investigation, with new data incorporated as it becomes available. The Inquisition's approach is to maintain multiple working hypotheses rather than commit to a single explanation. This approach reflects both the limitations of available evidence and the complexity of Tyranid biology. From a procedural standpoint, the subject is classified as a high-priority anomaly requiring continued observation and analysis. Engagement protocols emphasize caution, redundancy, and the assumption that apparent neutralization does not equate to permanent elimination. Interrogation efforts continue to focus on gathering consistent data points, with particular attention to identifying patterns that may clarify the nature of the organism. In the absence of definitive answers, the Inquisition's findings remain open-ended. Old One Eye is not fully understood, and its behavior does not conform entirely to established models. What is clear is that it represents a persistent and adaptable threat, one that challenges both tactical responses and analytical frameworks. The investigation, therefore, continues without resolution. The final tier of Inquisition records concerning Old One Eye exists within restricted archives, accessible only under specific clearance conditions and subject to partial redaction even at senior levels. These files do not present a unified narrative. Instead, they contain fragmented entries, sealed annotations, and cross-referenced incident logs that suggest a level of concern exceeding that found in standard Ordo-Xenos documentation. The subject is not merely categorized as a recurring Tyranid anomaly. It is treated as an unresolved variable within a broader pattern of Tyranid adaptability that has not yet been fully mapped. Redacted segments within these archives frequently correspond to temporal inconsistencies. Several entries reference sightings attributed to Old One Eye occurring within overlapping operational windows in separate systems. These entries are not accompanied by definitive confirmation, and the associated data is often incomplete or deliberately obscured. However, the existence of such records indicates that the possibility of simultaneous manifestations has been formally considered at the highest levels of analysis. The implications of this possibility are not explicitly stated, but their inclusion within restricted files suggests that they are regarded as strategically significant. One recurring classification within these documents is the designation of identity instability. This term is applied when a subject cannot be reliably defined as a singular entity or a reproducible type. In the case of Old One Eye, identity instability reflects the persistent ambiguity surrounding its nature. It may represent a single organism exhibiting extreme survivability and extended operational lifespan. It may represent multiple organisms sharing a common set of traits. It may represent a hybrid scenario, where an original organism has influenced subsequent Tyranid adaptations, resulting in a lineage of similar bioforms. None of these possibilities can be conclusively validated or dismissed. Certain redacted entries allude to internal debates within the Ordo Xenos regarding the interpretation of these findings. One position argues that Old One Eye should be treated as a symbolic construct, a name applied to a category of threats rather than an individual entity. This position emphasizes the risks associated with anthropomorphizing Tyranid organisms, which are fundamentally collective and non-individualistic. The opposing position maintains that the consistency of the observed traits, combined with the historical continuity of sightings, supports the existence of a singular persistent organism, or at least a direct replication of a specific biological template. These positions are not mutually exclusive, and both are retained within the archive. Additional classified material addresses the potential for Old One Eye to function as a carrier or catalyst for adaptive traits within the Tyranid ecosystem. This theory, while unconfirmed, suggests that the organism's repeated exposure to high-intensity combat environments may have driven the development of its regenerative capabilities, which are then assimilated and distributed by the Hive Mind. In this context, Old One Eye is not merely a product of Tyranid evolution, but an active participant in it. Its survival and continued operation provide data that informs future bioform development. This theory is supported indirectly by observations of later Tyranid forces, where similar regenerative traits appear with increased frequency. However, the causal relationship remains speculative. It is not possible to determine whether Old One Eye influenced these developments, or whether it represents an early instance of a broader evolutionary trend. The distinction is significant but unresolved. Redacted files also contain references to unsuccessful containment attempts. These entries are limited in detail, with key information removed or obscured. What can be inferred is that efforts have been made to secure or isolate organisms matching Old One Eye's profile for study. These efforts have not resulted in confirmed long-term containment. The reasons for failure are not fully disclosed, but likely factors include the organism's physical resilience, its regenerative capacity, and the operational challenges associated with engaging Tyranid bioforms outside controlled environments. One partially accessible entry describes an attempt to track the organism through a combination of sensor networks and predictive modelling. The objective was to anticipate its movement based on prior sightings and known Tyranid activity patterns. The results were inconclusive. While certain predictions aligned with subsequent reports, others did not, and the overall accuracy was insufficient to support reliable interception. This outcome reinforces the classification of Old One Eye as an unpredictable variable within Tyranid operations. Further classified observations address the interaction between Old One Eye and the absence or presence of synaptic control. In several recorded instances, the organism appears to operate independently of a visible synapse network, yet still demonstrates behavior consistent with broader Tyranid objectives. This has led to speculation that it may retain a form of residual connection to the Hive Mind, allowing it to function as an extension of the larger organism even when physically isolated. Alternatively, its behavior may be the result of deeply embedded biological directives that do not require active coordination. The distinction between these possibilities remains unclear, and the relevant sections of the archive are heavily redacted. What is evident is that the organism's ability to operate effectively in both coordinated and isolated contexts increases its strategic value within Tyranid forces. It is not dependent on the immediate presence of a hive fleet to remain operational, and it does not degrade in the same manner as lesser organisms when separated from synaptic control. A small number of entries within the classified files explore more speculative interpretations. These include the possibility that Old One Eye represents a form of biological persistence that challenges conventional definitions of life and death. In this view, the organism's repeated survival is not simply a function of regeneration, but of a more fundamental resilience at the cellular or systemic level. Such interpretations remain theoretical and are not supported by direct evidence. They are included within the archive as exploratory frameworks rather than established conclusions. The final sections of the redacted files shift focus from analysis to directive. Old One Eye is maintained within a high-priority threat category, with instructions for continued monitoring, rapid response, and comprehensive reporting of any sightings. Engagement protocols emphasize the need for overwhelming force, multi-phase verification, and the assumption that apparent termination may not be permanent. These directives are consistent with earlier Administratum and Mechanicus recommendations, but are reinforced within the Inquisition by the additional weight of unresolved anomalies. The conclusion drawn within these classified archives is deliberately restrained. Old One Eye is not defined in absolute terms. It is not declared singular, nor is it dismissed as a recurring pattern. Instead, it is recognized as a persistent anomaly that intersects with multiple aspects of Tyranid behavior, including regeneration, adaptation, and operational independence. Its continued presence across disparate engagements indicates that it occupies a role within the Tyranid ecosystem that is not yet fully understood. From an Inquisition perspective, the absence of definitive answers is not a failure of analysis, but a reflection of the subject's complexity. The appropriate response is not closure but sustained investigation. Old One Eye remains under active scrutiny, with each new report contributing to a body of knowledge that is still incomplete. In the context of these records, the most accurate final statement is also the most cautious. The subject persists.